Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.
Sense makers.
Hey, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Robert. Good to see you too. What do you got for us today?
Well, I'm going to finish up our series of episodes on key performance indicators and how we handle those in like everyday situations.
Great.
So far, we've gone through this a little bit backwards. I've talked about the end result, the dashboard itself, and how all of the little different pieces and parts and nuances of KPIs can be constructed to show the up-down indicators, the unit labels, and things like that. We've done another episode about KPI glossaries, which is defining all the KPIs and using that as kind of a tool to help figure out calculation logic and things like that. We haven't yet gone over the data structures. That's what I wanted to show everybody today.
Great. And I find in a lot of cases with Tableau, it's that because Tableau is kind of this data-driven drawing engine, the way we end up doing this kind of model of what do we want to see, and then stepping backwards to going, what does the data model need to look like to get what we want to see? So I'm not sure how reverse this is.
I'm going to show a little bit about what that data model looks like. Maybe not everything, but enough that a skilled data engineer or somebody who knows how to do data preparation can figure this out and combine all of these things together. The basic problem that we run into is that we end up with different data sources for every chart or dashboard. We've got a lot of different business units. We've got sales and we've got finance and operations, and we're going to have different KPIs for each one. And more than likely, we're going to have different data sources. We might have an entirely different data warehouse for each of these things, especially when we're talking about huge multinational corporations. We're talking about hundreds of different people inside each of these organizations. They're going to have their own systems of record, their own infrastructure, maybe even their own set of tools. Finance might not use Tableau for reporting, and sales might just be sitting on Salesforce and not actually use Tableau Desktop or anything like that. Who knows? But we've got all these different KPIs that we've got to look at inside of each business unit. But at a higher level, if we want to look across the company, how do we do that? That's kind of a problem, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And it's one of those places where people will get Tableau and they'll see the drag and drop whizziness of Tableau and think, oh my God, we're going to have a dashboard in a couple of weeks.
Right. And we can do that a lot of times. And we can do that for all of the sales KPIs and all the finance KPIs and all the operations KPIs and marketing and so on and so forth. But we end up with a different workbook, a different file, and we don't know where to find it. And just how do we combine that to look at a holistic view for all the KPIs across the entire company? Well, here's how we do that. At a very, very high level, we unify each data source into something that's just a singular KPI metrics query or view or prepared data source from your data engineering team or something like that. And then we join that up with the KPI glossary that we talked about on the last episode. And now we can end up with just one workbook, one set of charts that's scrollable and clickable and filterable and all those wonderful things that we love about Tableau or really any business intelligence solution. Even now AI chatbots, right? We want to be able to point that to something that's unified and structured and defined in just one place. So we don't have to go to a lot of different charts, a lot of different dashboards and different systems to find out about the KPIs for each different business unit.
Yes. And this kind of work can also, it can surface a lot of inconsistencies in the organization, like issues of data governance and so on, where different business units or different parts of the business use different terminology. as one area where I've had to spend a lot of time at times with this kind of thing.
Exactly. It is not at all trivial to try to combine these things. Like we can draw lines and just be like, oh, just take all these separate sources and just mash them into one. It's not so easy. But I think there is a data structure that we can use to pull things together at a high enough level that it's useful for that executive level reporting.
And another piece with doing this, going back to what we talked about in the previous episodes, is that having this kind of structure and organization makes it that much faster to iterate on the Tableau side.
Right.
And ultimately deliver those dashboards.
All right. So let's get into how does this unification actually work? How do we combine all of these things? What does that look like? So the first thing that we're going to do is just look at something like the sales data source, just one little piece of the business. And we're going to have something like this, where we're going to have different things happening across different dates. It might be rolled up to the month. It might be daily. It might be quarterly, any sort of level, right? But we're going to have something that's captured across dates. We're going to have something that's captured across different regions of the world or parts of the US and states and sales territories and all that stuff. We're going to count up our KPIs. How much did we sell in terms of dollars? How many total customers do we have as of a certain point in that month? And maybe also how many new customers have we gained? Right? Just really basic sales stuff. There's going to be more KPIs than this, but just let's keep it simple for now. This is pretty typical of what we might have in that sales data source to build a sales KPI dashboard.
Yep.
But if we take this and flip it a little bit and restructure it so that we stack those KPIs on top of each other, now suddenly we have a structure that allows us to combine it with all sorts of other things, right? So instead of having each KPI across its own column or each measure in its own column, we're going to flip this so that now what we have, if you're a Tableau aficionado, what we've done is we've codified and stored the measure names, measure values structure. So that KPI ID is your measure name, sales or customers or new customers, growth, what have you. And then off to the right, I've got this field that I'm calling KPI numerator. And from previous episodes, we've also talked about how you might have a denominator so that you can do ratio calculations for the sake of simplicity. And we're just showing one part of that equation. So that just top line, we have these numbers. This is the measure value. This is the KPI value that we want to show in the workbook. And you can see we've got a huge range of numbers. Some are in millions, some are thousands, some are just, a few dozen, right? But the magic of this is that we can take this structure and not just use it for sales, we can use it for everything else too. We can combine it with all those other things from different business units, and stack them one on top of the other.
Just to kind of reiterate that at this point, we've defined the data structure that is good for a tool like Tableau to render the data, and then we're conforming the various different data sets to that. And then adding a new KPI isn't adding a new column and rewriting calculations to handle that new KPI. Adding that new KPI is just adding some more rows to the data source.
You got it. It's just a union operation at that point.
Yep.
Right? So we get things into that structure with the KPI IDs, the KPI numerators and denominators, and then we just stack them on top of each other with that same structure from all across the business with union operations, which you can do in an ETL tool, or you can use SQL or Python, and just whatever your tool of choice might be to do that data preparation. As long as you can get it into that structure and start stacking things on top of each other, then you've got what you need.
Yep.
Now, just as another level of complexity here for the data engineers out there. It's like, well, okay, that's great, but we've got certain kinds of subtotals where that's just not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if we're talking about total customers, that's a distinct count of things. And we know that when we do that aggregation, well, that's cool if you're just looking at one slice, but now you want to filter by different things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
maybe I want to see total customers worldwide, but I also want to see customers from different regions. Now, most of the time, one customer sits in one region, but that's not always true. Okay, we
Mm-hmm.
might do business with a multinational company where some sales are from America, some sales are from Europe, and they cut across these regional boundaries for all kinds of reasons that I've come across
Mm-hmm.
in my experience. And so we can't simply add up all of the values from the different regions. We have to do some kind of pre-aggregation to do that worldwide total, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we have here is, you can see under the region column, I've got that all regions, and then I've got a breakdown of individual regions.
Mm-hmm.
In a system like Snowflake, which I think most people listening to nowadays are that's going to be their tool of choice, there's a command called group by rollup, where you can actually do these rollups and have these different subtotals in the data source itself, rather than maybe bringing thousands, millions of records into Tableau to do that count distinct operation. So that is one of the challenges, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that there are certain cases where we have to do subtotals, and we have to do it at the data source level.
Yep. And I think one piece for me in this, to go back to sort of why this structure is useful, is when those subtotals are just extra rows in our data
Yeah.
versus extra columns, it just becomes a lot easier to manipulate.
Yeah. It becomes easier to manipulate, but also becomes easier to make errors. So the caution that I have to give to people is, if we're not forcing some kind of filtering on that region dimension, your KPIs are going to be all messed up because now
Mm-hmm.
we're adding up regional totals with the worldwide, and nothing is right. So
Mm-hmm.
it carries some risk in simplifying and grouping all of these things together across all the business units, across all the data sources, and adding these subtotals. It's not a very common design for a data structure, because of the
Mm-hmm.
risk that if we don't have just the right filters specified in just the right way, we're going to end up double counting.
Yeah, one method I've used for that is using parameters or sets
Exactly.
to
Yep.
such that I'm able to control that list of values that people are
Yep.
selecting separately from what's in the data. And then there's a
Right.
calculated field that is making sure the filter logic is appropriately implemented.
And just as an extra precaution, maybe that calculation logic that matches the parameter selection to your filter criteria is set at the data source level or
Mm-hmm.
global filter level, so that you just guarantee whatever worksheet I'm building, I'm not double counting things.
Yep.
Let's talk about another scenario that's also just a little bit difficult to deal with. There are some KPIs where it's very time sensitive, very time bound. And so we have to have some pre-aggregations for that as well. And even if you don't need the pre-aggregations, there are some things that we can do with date ranges that make it a little bit simpler to perform calculations and visualizations in your BI tool like Tableau. So here I've got this column that I've added called period type. And a lot of people watching are probably familiar with some of these acronyms, but I'll just define it just in case people haven't come across what do these terms mean. So we might be calculating new customers on a year-to-date basis. How many have we gained from January 1st to now? Or the prior year to date, right? We don't want to count the entire year from January to December. We want to count it from January to whatever point in the year we're at. For comparison's sake, last year we gained this many customers by this time versus now. Or we're going to look at that on a monthly basis, current month versus prior month. That's your CM and PM. And I've seen so many variations on time frames. Current month to date, trailing 12 weeks, trailing 13 weeks, trailing 90 days, so on. It just goes on and on for all sorts of unique business reasons. But in this data structure, we can do that. We can do that pre-calculated total for given KPIs in a given slice of time, so that we're not doing that time slice at the reporting level.
Yep. Yeah, that's a place. It's honestly one of the knocks that I hear against Tableau sometimes, is that Tableau doesn't make the prior year to date, prior year, and so on as easy as some other tools.
Yeah.
And it is a place where, when we're trying to do this unified reporting across the enterprise, it's worth it to take the time to do that in the data source that we're using for Tableau, instead of trying to do all the calculations inside the visualization that's rendering this. Another thing for me in using this is, I've had some reporting scenarios where the periods were very different for different KPIs, but yet we wanted to show that HR number that was available once a year, with the operational metric that was updated daily that we were aggregating to the month level.
That's a great point. There's going to be KPIs recorded differently across different business units. In some places, that data is only available once a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
In some places, it's available hourly. It's just coming in and streaming in almost real time. And so somehow, just like we had to deal with different geographic regions, and somehow combine those things, we do have to deal with different date levels and different date granularities. And this structure allows us to do that when we add in these kinds of dimensions.
And one more, as long as we're talking about this with dates, one of the things when we start thinking this way about it, and we have this separate KPI source that can exist as its own artifact, so that we can have this to go back to say, what did we report at this date? And if it changed, if we had to retroactively change it, we can report on this is the retroactive change. Versus if we're just running queries in real time against our data, we don't have that separate store to refer to.
That's right. Because once we have all of these things in a unified structure, we can now do what I call snapshotting, where on a given reporting cycle, maybe we report on these things on the first of the month or the last of the month. We just capture a snapshot of all of those metrics as of a certain day. And I'll just store that literally for calling it the as of date or the report date. What is the day where we just captured that point in time for all of these metrics? And the reason that's possible is because we're dealing with very highly aggregated data, right? We may be taking in something from a source system with tens of millions of records, but because we're pre-aggregating these KPIs across all of these business units, we're generally dealing with a fairly small data set. And so we can capture point in time values, store that as of a given date, call it the report date, and compare, well, if there are revisions or if there's any reason to look at things in the past for that as of date, maybe those cumulative year-to-date metrics. What did our year-to-date metrics look like in February versus July.
Mm-hmm.
We have a small enough data set that we can do that.
Yep. Yeah, and if we're adding in other things like budget and forecast and actuals, those just become additional rows in there
Exactly. Right.
that let us have those comparisons.
Right. And that could be your time slice, right? That could be that period column. So instead of current year to date, prior year to date, it's also budget value, forecast value. That can be your time range. Is what was our financial plan for this year? And so instead of CYTD, it just says plan in that particular column. And you can compare all of those things. That's a great point. So I know that's just really complex, and it's hard to talk through verbally without dozens of examples and things like that. But I think the people who watch this podcast have come across these kinds of situations, worked with data enough to understand what we're going for here, and can kind of figure out, based on what I've got coming in, how do I structure it into that method that I showed, where it's just, what's the KPI name, what's the KPI value, numerator and denominator. And once you've got it that, you can mash it all together and do all the things that we talked about, and go back to the previous episode, talk about the KPI glossaries, because now with that KPI name, we can merge it with the definitions, the who's responsible for this KPI, who do we email, what's the business logic, is it good if it goes up, or is it good if it goes down for this KPI, what are the units, and how do we handle the rounding of those units in the reporting layer. All of that happens in the KPI glossary. And so that becomes useful when we have this unified KPI metric. We just put those together, and now we've got a single source that looks across the entire company. Well, Jonathan, thanks for your feedback today and your experience. I know you've come across this. So many people who listen to this podcast and watch us online, I think have come across similar situations and maybe have wondered, how do we do this? I found this very useful. I hope that other people find this helpful as an approach to solve just what I think is a very common problem.
Great.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.